Last year, I embarked on a road trip to visit a few friends I had gone to high school with. They had relocated to the city of Berkeley to attend the University of California. Ever since, every summer, I make the journey to see them and enjoy that time together since we were classmates throughout high school and are practically like family. Typically, I fly for this trip, but last year I chose to drive because there were numerous places along the way that I wanted to explore, including parks, museums, and historical landmarks that I was eager to check out. I departed early that morning to allow myself enough time to visit these spots, as completing the entire journey would take several days, and I wanted to optimize my time. The initial 2 days of the trip went smoothly and were entirely uneventful. But on the third day, I expected to have arrived at my destination, yet I found myself still driving in the middle of the night. It was likely around 9 or 10 p.m. at that point. The highway was very quiet, and there wasn't much traffic, which was quite pleasant, albeit a bit unsettling, since I have always had a slight fear of empty roads. I still had a few hours left to drive, and I was eager to reach my friend's place as quickly as possible, but I needed to use the restroom and grab a coffee to wake myself up a bit. So I pulled off at the next exit, where there was a rest area by the roadside. This one was rather small, nothing like those large rest stops that feature truck parking and a gas station nearby. This was merely a modest building with a line of parking spaces in front of it, but that was all I required, so it suited me perfectly. Upon my arrival, I noticed that it was quite dim, and it didn't appear that anyone else was around. I parked my vehicle and began walking towards the building. I took my time and paused to stretch a bit since I had been driving for several hours, and my muscles were beginning to feel stiff. Once I entered the building, I looked around and observed a hallway with a janitor's closet and a men's restroom on one side and a women's restroom on the opposite side. There were also a couple of vending machines and a stand with magazines. I glanced at one of the vending machines for a moment, searching for an energy drink, then turned around and spotted a car that had just pulled into the rest area and parked right next to mine. I found this somewhat peculiar, given all the available spaces. Why park so close to my car? I tried not to dwell on it too much and headed into the restroom, took care of what I needed to do, and came out about 5 minutes later. As I stepped out, I noticed that the car remained parked right next to mine, its lights still on, suggesting that the driver was still inside. This made me curious about what the driver was doing, but it didn't seem significant, so I looked around and my attention drifted back to the vending machine. I decided to grab a Red Bull, and while I was drinking it, I couldn't shake the feeling to glance back at the car parked beside mine. For some reason, it gave me an uneasy sensation. When I turned to look at my car, I observed that the car next to mine was still running. I began to walk out, but just a few meters from the door, I heard the engine of that car shut off, and a moment later, the driver's door swung open. A tall man with a beard emerged, dressed in a brown leather jacket with both hands tucked in his pockets. I paused where I was near the door, and the man began striding towards me. Suddenly, tension flooded my body, as there was something about him that distinctly sent chills down my spine. Nevertheless, I maintained my composure and tried to appear calm, though I was genuinely anxious, especially because his gaze was fixed on me and seemed genuinely sinister. As he approached, just a few meters away, I stepped away from the door and started making my way toward my car, and inevitably we crossed paths. I nodded in greeting, and he reciprocated. However, as I took a couple of steps forward, I heard him call me back with a, "Hey." At that moment, I turned around, only to be confronted with the barrel of a 9mm pistol, pointed straight at my face, accompanied by the man's ghastly grin. "Why are you in such a rush?" he asked me as I struggled to steady my breathing, which was becoming quicker and quicker. I raised my hands to show I wasn't resisting and asked him what he wanted, to which he replied bluntly, "Give me your watch, your wallet, and your phone." I complied with his demands without hesitation, thinking that would be all, and he would let me go afterward. However, after handing over everything he requested, he motioned with his head for me to follow him. But instead of leading me into the building, he directed me toward the back, where the woods were. We entered the forest. In that moment, my heart was racing because I was convinced that if he merely wanted to rob me, he would have let me go. Instead, he was guiding me into this forest, which clearly indicated he had ulterior motives. I was certain that, for some reason, he intended to kill me. As I walked toward the destination, I asked him why he was taking me there, and he simply responded, "Just walk." I was terrified and pleaded with him to let me go. I offered him my car if he wanted it, but he remained silent. After we had walked about 15 or 20 meters into the woods, he ordered me to stop and turn around. I complied, and we faced each other. He was only about 2 meters away from me, and then he aimed his gun directly at my face. At that moment, I knew it was the end for me. I was going to die right there, deep in the forest, far from anywhere. The only thought running through my mind was the anguish my parents would feel when they received the news. At that moment, I could feel tears streaming down my cheeks and every fiber of my body trembling while this wretched man gazed at me with eyes filled with malice. He commanded me to kneel, and I did. Knowing these were the final moments of my life, I shut my eyes tightly, bracing for the gunshot. And then it happened. Bang, bang, bang. 3 shots in rapid succession. I covered my ears with my hands and screamed with each explosion, collapsing onto the ground, sobbing and in utter panic. I'm dead, I thought. But I felt nothing. No pain, no sign of being hurt, just the most intense terror I had ever experienced in my life. A fear so profound it reverberated through my bones. That's when I heard his laughter. The man was roaring with laughter as if he had just heard the funniest joke imaginable. While I remained on the ground, crying and terrified, he said, "Go home, kid, and don't forget to wash your pants." Then he turned and walked away, chuckling as if nothing had happened. I began to touch myself, checking for any wounds, and there were none. In that instant, I realized he had shot at me. I can't quite describe what I felt at that moment. It was a blend of terror, relief at being alive and unharmed, and an overwhelming sense of humiliation. It was an emotional cocktail I couldn't process, so I remained on the ground for several minutes while I heard the sound of his car's engine starting and then fading away. Only then did I muster the strength to stand up and walk back to my car. But first, I returned to the building and washed my face in the restroom. Looking in the mirror, I saw that I looked terrible. My face was red and swollen, smeared with a sticky mixture of tears and mucus. I was grateful to be alive, but I also felt profoundly humiliated and despondent. While my body continued to tremble uncontrollably, I realized I was still in a state of shock. After a few minutes, I exited the building and drove to the nearest town. There, I was able to borrow a phone and called the police. Later, I recounted my ordeal to the officers and provided them with a detailed description of the man. That night, I rented a room in that town and stayed there. The following day, feeling somewhat better, I continued on my journey, but without stopping anywhere. I drove straight to my friend's house. Once I arrived, I told them what had transpired, and they couldn't believe it. They were equally shocked by how close I came to losing my life that night. I stayed at my friend's place for a couple of weeks, as I do every year, and during that time, I tried to act as normally as possible. But deep down, I was deeply shaken. The shock lingered for months, and even now, when I reflect on that experience, I relive the same emotions that overwhelmed me that day. I knew nothing about the man who robbed me and nearly took my life, so I have no idea if they ever caught him or if he is still out there terrorizing others. I just tried to move on with my life, but I can say I've never stopped at a rest area since then. Hello, my name is Dan, and I have been working as a truck driver for over 25 years. The story I'm about to share with you took place around 4 years ago, and it's something that changed my life forever. It was a rainy night, and I was driving my massive truck down the highway, which was entirely deserted at that hour, 4 a.m. I had about 4 hours left to reach the company's warehouse, where I needed to deliver a load of industrial supplies when suddenly a torrential downpour appeared out of nowhere. The heavy rain made visibility on the road quite difficult. However, after so many years in this profession, I can confidently say that I'm pretty accustomed to driving under such conditions and for extended periods, even though the rain was annoying, as I knew it would delay my entire journey. Yet the downpour wasn't the only thing bothering me that night, for some inexplicable reason. Since I entered that last stretch of road, an unsettling restlessness began to envelop my body. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. All I knew was that something felt off. Perhaps it was the eerie stillness surrounding me, or the many hours I had been driving without a break. What was certain, though, was that I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I attempted to push it aside by turning on some music on the radio, and it did help distract my mind somewhat, but the odd restlessness never dissipated. I continued driving despite the poor visibility, but I slowed my speed to maintain maneuverability in case something unexpected occurred. It's a precaution I always take when driving in rain. However, a few kilometers ahead, something truly unexpected happened. The rain continued to pour heavily while the fog grew thicker. Still, I could see through the fog the lights of a vehicle that appeared to be speeding in the opposite direction and was heading straight toward me. Due to the dense fog, I couldn't see it until it was nearly on top of my truck. I immediately and instinctively turned the steering wheel in a last-ditch effort to avoid it. But as I did, the wetness of the road made it impossible for me to regain control of the truck. And despite my best efforts to stabilize it, I ended up flipping violently and skidding off the road. The last thing I remember was the feeling of weightlessness as the truck spun and the deafening sound of metal crashing as it overturned. When I came to, I found myself lying on the cold ground, and everything was a blur. My head was pounding with pain, and my body felt heavy. I tried to move but couldn't, soon realizing that I was severely injured and unable to move my legs, completely shocked as I attempted to recall what had just transpired. Eventually, it all came rushing back. The collision, my attempts to right the truck rolling over, the noise, the banging, and now here I was, lying in the middle of nowhere, injured and alone. I tried to call for help, but my voice was barely above a whisper. I could hardly make a sound. Trapped in the wreckage, I had no idea how long I would survive while lying there, struggling to keep my eyes open. I summoned all the strength I had left to try to shout for help, but it was futile because, at that moment, I began to hear footsteps drawing near. In the distance, I could discern the sound of an engine running. Moments later, an older man approached me, accompanied by a younger man. They were a father and son. They assisted me and called for an ambulance. At times, I could feel my consciousness fading, but I held on as long as possible, knowing that help was on the way. Finally, the ambulance arrived, and I was rushed to the hospital. During the ride, I was in and out of consciousness, but I recall the doctors telling me that I had multiple broken bones, internal bleeding, and a severe head injury. They also mentioned that I was fortunate to be alive. I couldn't believe it. I had been in a near-fatal accident, and I had no idea how I would recover from it, or if I truly would, because, judging by what the doctors were saying, it was possible that these were my final moments in this world. Fortunately, I survived, but the recovery process was so excruciating that at times, I wished I hadn't. Days turned into weeks, and I remained in the hospital trying to heal from my injuries. I couldn't move and was completely reliant on the nurses and doctors. I had never felt so powerless in my life. As the days passed, I began to notice strange occurrences around me. There were instances when I would wake up in the middle of the night and feel as if someone was watching me. At first I thought it was just me, possibly due to brain damage or some injury to my head. But as it happened more frequently, I started to believe that something was genuinely wrong. One night, while lying in my hospital bed, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a tall, dark silhouette, but I couldn't make out any details. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. As the figure began to approach me, I attempted to move, but I couldn't. It was a truly desperate and terrifying situation. The figure kept coming closer until I could feel its cold breath on my face. I shut my eyes tightly and began to pray. I was so frightened that I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I remained in that position for a few minutes, finally opening my eyes to find that it was gone. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when the nurses came in the morning, I told them what I had experienced. They dismissed it, suggesting it was simply a case of sleep paralysis, likely a consequence of my brain injury and the stress of everything I'd been through. But I disagreed. I was convinced that what I had seen was entirely real, and not just a hallucination as they suggested. From that day on, I began to see the figure more frequently, at all times of the day. You might think that over time I would grow accustomed to it, but I didn't. Each encounter was utterly terrifying, and it was driving me mad. However, I chose not to mention it again. Instead, I started researching online, feeling somehow certain that this figure was connected to my accident. During my search, I discovered that there had been many similar accidents on that particular stretch of road, and many of the victims claimed to have experienced strange occurrences. Some spoke of seeing the lights of an oncoming car before their crashes, while others described encountering a figure in the middle of the road that led to their accidents. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone in my experience, and that indeed, the figure that seemed to be haunting me day and night was the reason behind my accident. Fear mixed with anger washed over me. I wanted to know why this was happening to me. I wanted to uncover the identity of that figure and understand why it was pursuing me. The man who had stopped to help me that day, along with his son, was named William. He accompanied me to the hospital, informed my family about what happened, and before leaving, he gave me his phone number, saying I could reach out if I ever needed anything. I couldn't have been more grateful, as he and his son were like guardian angels that night. I recalled that he had arrived at the scene almost immediately, which meant he must have been very close when the accident occurred. I called him that afternoon and asked him what he saw. His answer confirmed my suspicions. He hadn't seen any other vehicle. He told me he was driving just a few meters behind my truck when he suddenly noticed it veering sharply to the left and zigzagging before finally going off the road and rolling over. He assured me that no other car was approaching, and in fact, no vehicle passed by until the ambulance arrived. Although I had already suspected this was what truly happened to me, hearing William confirm it sent chills down my spine. That figure, or ghost, had almost caused me to lose my life, just as it had with many drivers before me. But the strangest thing occurred that same night. Later, around 11 p.m., the figure reappeared at the foot of my bed. This time, instead of vanishing, it approached and positioned itself beside me. It began to whisper words to me, revealing its story. The figure told me it was a truck driver who had died in an accident on that same stretch of road many years ago. It recounted how it had been driving through a night as dark and rainy as this one, when suddenly, out of nowhere, a car appeared coming the opposite way. Unlike me, the figure couldn't avoid the collision, and they crashed head-on, resulting in no survivors. I froze, and just as I was about to ask who he was, a nurse entered the room to administer my nighttime treatment. That was the last time the figure appeared to me. I never saw it again. The following day, I began my research on accidents in that area. After several hours of digging, I stumbled upon a news article from 35 years prior. It detailed a fatal crash on that highway where a drunk driver drove the wrong way and collided head-on with a cargo truck, resulting in the instant deaths of both drivers. However, there were no specifics about those involved in the accident. Upon reading this news, I realized that it wasn't the spirit of the truck driver causing my accident, as I had assumed, but rather the spirit of the other car's driver. The saddest part was likely that both souls were trapped in that moment, unable to move on. Since then, whenever I have the chance, I say a prayer for both of them, hoping they find peace and can finally rest. My name is Eloy, and all of this took place in August 2008. I remember it as vividly as if it were yesterday. It was one of the hottest summers we'd experienced in years, and I found myself behind the wheel of my old cargo truck, hauling a load of steel sheets destined for a construction site in southern Missouri. With over 20 years of truck driving under my belt, I honestly thought I had seen it all. But what happened that day still haunts me. I was cruising down Highway 60 through the Mark Twain National Forest. It's a stunning area by day, but can feel desolate and eerie at night. I was making good time and planned to stop at a truck stop near Springfield for a restroom break, a bite to eat, and a quick nap before continuing on my route. However, a few miles before reaching the stop, I spotted an old beat-up truck parked on the roadside with its hood up. As I approached, I noticed a chubby guy waving his arms at me. In our world, truck drivers have an unspoken code. We always help each other. So I slowed down, parked a bit ahead, and walked over to see what was going on. The man, around 45 years old, wore a flannel shirt that was once white but was now stained with grease, just like his face and hands. It was clear he had been working on his truck for quite a while, maybe all day. As the sun began to set, he walked toward me, relief evident on his face. "Thank God you stopped," he said, shaking my hand. He introduced himself as Neil and explained he'd been stranded for about 4 or 5 hours due to a damaged alternator. He asked if I could take him to the nearest town about 20 miles away so he could spend the night and hopefully find a mechanic and the part in the morning. After sizing him up, I decided he seemed harmless enough, and I couldn't bear to leave him there alone. Neil grabbed a small duffel bag from his truck and climbed into the passenger seat of mine. We set off, and he was quite chatty, telling me he was from Alabama and on his way to pick up a load in St. Louis. He mentioned his old truck had been giving him trouble for weeks, but he thought he could push it a bit further. About 15 to 20 minutes down the road, I noticed a couple of cars in my rearview mirror. They were tailing us closely, and at first, I thought they were just impatient drivers wanting to pass. but they never attempted to overtake, which felt strange considering we were the only vehicles on the road at that hour. Growing uneasy, I asked Neil if he recognized them, nodding toward the rearview mirror. He looked and said he didn't know them. I joked about whether he was running from someone, but he laughed nervously, his voice trembling, a sign that he was as anxious as I was. Those cars trailing us made me increasingly uneasy. They followed for about 10 miles without trying to pass, which only heightened my suspicions. When we reached a stretch of road flanked by woods, the cars finally made their move. They sped up, passed us, and suddenly cut across the road, forcing me to slam on the brakes. "What the hell?" I exclaimed. The cars stopped abruptly in front of us, and 3 armed men climbed out, walking straight toward my truck. My heart pounded in my chest, and when I glanced at Neil, he was pale and sweating. I whispered to him to stay calm as I reached under my seat, only to realize I had left my gun at home. Recently, the company I worked for had started cracking down on drivers carrying firearms, which is why I hadn't brought it on this trip. The men approached my truck and positioned themselves at both doors, guns drawn. One of them ordered us to get out. I looked at Neil, who appeared on the verge of passing out, and raised my hands in surrender. "I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I told them they could take whatever they wanted, but the same guy repeated his demand for us to get out of the truck, this time with a more aggressive tone. We complied, slowly stepping down from the cab. As we did, Neil stumbled and almost fell. Another thug ordered us to move to the side of the road, keeping his gun trained on us, then instructed us to empty our pockets. We handed over our wallets, phones, and keys. "You can take the truck if you want," I said desperately. "Shut up," he snapped. He grabbed our belongings and tossed them into one of the cars. Then he walked back toward us while the other 2 continued to aim their weapons. He threw the truck keys back at me and gestured for me to get in and start it. I looked at Neil, who wore an expression of confusion. "For your own sake and your friends, don't try anything," the guy warned. I climbed back into the cab with one of the thugs still pointing his gun at me. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. The guy motioned for Neil to get into one of the cars. The ringleader ordered him to get in while I was to stay in the truck. I had no idea what their plan was, but I wasn't about to argue with a gun in my face. I started driving, following the car Neil was in, while another thug trailed behind us. We drove for what felt like hours, although it was probably only about 20 minutes. They took us down a narrow dirt road that veered off the highway and deep into the forest. My mind raced, searching for escape routes, but it felt hopeless. Even if I found a way out, I wouldn't abandon Neil to those thugs. They would likely retaliate against him. It was a complicated and terrifying situation. As the trees closed in around us, I knew we were heading into a trap. Finally, the cars stopped in a small clearing in the woods. The men got out, still holding their guns, and motioned for me to exit the truck. I climbed out, my hands shaking and heart racing. If they had brought us this far, it surely wasn't for anything good. I reasoned that if they only wanted to rob us, they could have done it on the road and left with our belongings. The ringleader gestured for me to follow him into the woods, where Neil was already being led by another thug, a short, stocky guy with a devilish look that sent chills down my spine. He turned to me and offered a macabre half-smile. We walked for a few minutes until we reached an old, abandoned cabin. Fear twisted my insides at the sight. The men pushed us inside, revealing only a couple of old pieces of furniture and a lot of garbage. They ordered us to sit on a dusty couch. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The ringleader smiled again, a cruel grin. "Just make sure you don't run to the police." His companions laughed, and then he started to bind our hands and feet. I felt cold sweat trickle down my body as the third guy mocked, "Don't go anywhere," sending the group into another round of laughter. Then they exited the cabin, slamming the door shut behind them. As soon as they left, I began struggling to loosen the ropes. "We have to get out of here," I told Neil, who was pale and shaking uncontrollably. "They're going to kill us, aren't they?" he whispered, fear evident in his voice. "Not if we escape first," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I worked desperately to loosen the knots binding my wrists. It was a slow, painful process, but I could feel the ropes starting to give way. Suddenly, we heard the sound of a car engine revving up and driving away, leaving us enveloped in the eerie silence of the forest. Once I managed to free myself, I quickly untied Neil's hands and feet. "Thanks, buddy," he said, his voice cracking with relief. I tried to lighten the moment, saying, "Save your gratitude for when we're really safe." He nodded. We stumbled out of the cabin and looked around. It was dark and visibility was low, but we could tell the cars were gone, and so was my truck. Neil asked if I knew how to get back. The truth was, we had wandered so deep into the woods that my sense of direction was hazy. But I knew we needed to head in the opposite direction of the cabin, hoping to find the road. So we set off, pushing through the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we finally stumbled upon the road. We began to wonder if it was a good idea to leave the cabin, as panic surged through us at the thought that the men might come back. But if we wanted to get help, we couldn't stay in the woods. So, we started walking, sticking to the edge of the road and ready to dive into the trees at the first sign of danger. The sun had set, leaving us with only the moonlight reflecting off the leaves of the trees. I kept my ears alert, straining to catch any sounds of approaching vehicles. After what felt like an eternity, we heard the faint sound of a vehicle approaching. I shivered, fearing it might be our attackers. "Neil, get down," I hissed, dragging him into the brush. We crouched, holding our breath as the car slowly approached. Then we realized it wasn't one of the cars from earlier. It was an old, beat-up sedan, and the driver appeared to be an older man, likely a local. Relieved but cautious, I stood up and waved my arms. "Hey, hey," we shouted. The driver slowed down and stopped, rolling down his window, eyeing us with suspicion. "What's going on here?" he asked warily. "Please, we need your help," I explained quickly, recounting how our car was stolen and we had been kidnapped. I begged him to call the police since the thieves had taken our phones and all our belongings. The man regarded us for a few seconds, then nodded. "Get in, I'll take you to the sheriff's office." We climbed into the back seat, exhausted and relieved. The man introduced himself as Jeff and drove us to the nearest town, a little place called Ellington, dropping us off at the sheriff's office. Once inside, we gave our statements, detailing the three men and everything that had happened. The sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Stuart, took our story seriously. "We'll send a patrol to look for your truck and we'll get those men," he assured us. "You two are lucky to be alive." Neil and I exchanged a look, both shaken to our cores. The sheriff's deputies led us back to the clearing in the woods, but there was no sign of our attackers. However, as we walked the perimeter, an officer radioed in that they had found my abandoned truck. We hurried to that location with the sheriff, and sure enough, there was my truck, left behind in the trees but otherwise intact. "Keep your eyes peeled," the sheriff advised as we prepared to leave. "These guys might come back." We thanked him and got back on the road, heading for the nearest truck stop. We needed to call our companies to report what had happened, but more than anything, we needed to rest. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the thought of how close we had come to dying out there. I always considered myself tough, but this experience had shaken me to my core. Neil sat silently, staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. We parted ways at the truck stop, exchanging phone numbers and promises to stay in touch, but we never saw each other again. I remember him every time I passed through southern Missouri. That night changed me significantly. I became more cautious and aware of the dangers on the road. I still help others when I can, but I'm always on guard, ready for the unexpected. And every now and then, when I'm driving down the darkest, loneliest stretches of highway, I think about those men. I wonder if they ever got caught, or if they're still out there, looking for their next victim. But I refuse to let that consume me. Life goes on, and so do I. After all, the road has always been my best place. There's always another load to haul, another destination to reach. As long as I'm behind the wheel, I'll keep moving forward, no matter what lies ahead. My name is Ernesto, and the story I'm about to tell you happened one night when I encountered the scariest situation of my life. I used to work night shifts at an old ranch in Arizona that had been converted into a hotel. It was a good job, probably the easiest I'd ever had, though the downside was my hour-and-a-half commute home every night. At first, I hated it as it ate into my free time, but eventually I got used to it. One night, while making my usual drive home, I stopped at a taco truck halfway there to grab a bite to eat. I was starving and couldn't wait to get home. The truck was parked outside an RV park, likely run by the owner who lived there or drove in every night to sell his tacos. I had seen the truck several times over the past 2 months, but I had never stopped because I was always in too much of a hurry. That night, however, my hunger won out. I pulled over, my stomach rumbling loudly, and approached the taco truck. As I pulled off the road and headed toward the entrance of the trailer park, I felt a familiar sense of excitement. I got out of my car and walked toward the taco truck, eager to indulge in my latest culinary discovery. To my surprise, this taco guy was serving up some of the best tacos I had ever tasted. I ordered a few to go and savored every bite in my car, overwhelmed by how good they were. Hunger can make even the simplest meal taste like glory. That night marked the beginning of a routine. The next evening, I stopped by again, and the following night as well. It became a regular stop on my way home from work. I no longer rushed back to my car to eat. I stood by the truck, enjoying the tacos with gusto and taking full advantage of the variety of salsas he offered. I'd finish off my meal with a soda and a cigarette, always grateful for those lovely lemon-scented hand wipes he'd give me. Over the next few months, I visited the truck nearly 40 or 50 times. Despite the frequent conversations, I curiously never learned the guy's name. I didn't ask the first time, and then it just felt awkward to bring it up. I figured he didn't need to know my name either. I was just one of many regulars at his taco truck. Looking back, I regret not asking him for his name. One day, that information would prove to be crucial, maybe even life-saving. It frustrated me that I hadn't taken the time to ask. On the day it happened, I parked my car in the usual spot and walked toward the truck. But something felt off. This was the first time I arrived, and the taco guy wasn't inside, preparing his food. There were no other customers either. It was as if the world had fallen silent, leaving just me there. I waited a few moments, hoping he was just delayed, maybe checking something in the back, but he didn't come out. After several minutes, I thought I could just whistle or call out to him, and he'd appear to serve me. But when I called out, no one answered. The silence was unnerving, and as I looked around, I noticed an acrid burning smell wafting from the grill. I stood on my tiptoes, trying to peek over the side of the large taco truck. Yes, something was definitely burning. Smoke began to curl up into the air. "Hey, I think you're burning something here, buddy," I shouted, but still, there was no response, only the ominous sizzle of whatever was cooking on the grill above me. At this point, frustration morphed into concern. If whatever was burning continued, it could be dangerous. Not only could it ruin his grill, but the entire truck could catch fire. It was no exaggeration. One spark could lead to disaster. More than that, this man had worked hard to build his business, and I didn't want to see him lose everything. I genuinely liked this guy. I enjoyed our brief chats when I complained about work or shared a laugh. He was consistent and reliable, a rarity in this world. If I were in his shoes, I'd want someone to intervene and prevent my livelihood from going up in flames. I had no idea where he could be or if he was dealing with a medical emergency. The only certainty I had was that I didn't want to watch my favorite taco truck go up in smoke. Determined to help, I walked around to the side of the truck where the entrance was. There was a narrow door with a set of retractable stairs. I climbed up, grabbed the door handle, and opened it. The sight that greeted me made my heart drop. The cash register was empty, the drawer overturned, and loose change lay scattered across the floor. The first thought that flashed through my mind was robbery. However, I didn't see any signs of a struggle or violence. The cash drawer had been pulled out, but there was no indication that a fight had taken place. A robber could have threatened my taco guy, forced him to run, and emptied the register before escaping. The mere thought of that possibility filled me with anger. This was a hard-working man who had likely sacrificed a great deal to build his taco truck business. Feeling a mix of urgency and dread, I stepped inside to investigate further. A crook had come along, stealing the fruits of all his labor, most likely to feed a drug habit. As I surveyed the scene, I was grateful it seemed clean and orderly, at least indicating that no one had been hurt. That relief evaporated when I stepped closer to the grill to turn it off. As I ascended a couple of metal steps, my heart nearly stopped from shock and panic. There, burned into the grill, was a perfect jet-black outline of a completely scorched hand. The sight was so horrifying that I stumbled backward down the stairs, somehow managing to keep my balance. All I could do was try not to look at it again as I opened the small cabinet beneath the grill and put out the flames. Once the fire was extinguished, I walked back to the truck door, closed it, and returned to my car to call the police. As I sat in my vehicle, I found myself at a loss for words. I knew there had been a robbery and someone had been seriously injured, but I had no idea where the taco guy had gone or where he might have been taken after the attack. Even worse, I didn't even know his name. It was a complete mystery, and the only reason I could be sure this wasn't just an accident was the empty cash register. I answered a series of questions from the operator, who assured me that a couple of officers would be dispatched to handle the situation. After reporting the incident, I didn't have to stay at the scene, but I felt compelled to. I wanted to be there in case the taco guy returned, perhaps with a bandage around his arm. But after waiting for 30 or 40 minutes, no one showed up, not even the police. Feeling a sense of dread, I decided to leave. The drive home felt surreal. My mind was spinning, replaying what I had just witnessed. I wondered why the police hadn't arrived with sirens blaring when something so terrible had occurred. Regret gnawed at me for not knowing the taco guy's name. If I had known it, I could have looked him up or been more helpful to the authorities. I tried Googling phrases like taco truck owner burned by robber, but the results yielded only violent robbery stories that didn't match the scene I had encountered. Days turned into weeks, and I never saw the taco truck again. They had moved it, and I never heard from the taco guy. I just hoped he was okay. This all happened 6 years ago, in June 2018. That experience haunted me for some time, but I decided to put it behind me. A few months later, I went on an impromptu solo trip, hoping to clear my head. I loved sightseeing, and there were a few places nearby that I wanted to visit before returning to college in August. The plan was simple. Start early, hit a few sites, and head back home around 9 p.m. I figured I could maximize my time without having to pay for a hotel. The drive there was uneventful, but the return trip was a different story. I ended up leaving around 10 p.m. Apple Maps estimated about 4.5 hours to get home. About halfway through the drive, fatigue set in, and I struggled to stay awake. I splashed water on my face from my canteen, but it was futile. At one point, I realized it was getting dangerous to drive. I told myself I would stop at the next red stop I saw and take a quick nap before continuing. A few miles down the road, I found a rest stop and pulled into the empty parking lot. The first thing I noticed was the eerie stillness. The place was completely deserted. If it weren't for a few lights, I might have thought it was abandoned. I leaned back in my seat, setting an alarm for an hour. When the alarm went off, I realized I had to use the bathroom. My bladder always complicates things. I walked toward the building, found the restrooms, and opened one of the stalls. I was in and out in about 30 seconds when I suddenly heard someone talking outside in the hallway. The noise surprised me. My car had been the only one in the lot just a minute ago, so I couldn't fathom how someone had gotten here so fast. Then the restroom door swung open. My nerves kicked in, but I figured it was just another traveler I hadn't noticed. I was about to leave when I heard light knocking on the stall door. "Is someone there?" I called, but silence answered me. Anxiety crept in, and I decided to remain in the stall until whoever it was left. That's when I noticed an eye peering through the crack in the door. When our eyes met, the man started screaming, relentlessly banging his head against the door. "What the hell?" I whispered, panic rising. Thinking quickly, I braced my body against the door, trying to prevent him from breaking it down. But when he wouldn't stop, I threw the door open, knocking him down, and bolted out of the restroom, sprinting toward my car. I was halfway to the parking lot when I heard the front door swing open behind me. I glanced back, and sure enough, the man was chasing me. Despite my adrenaline-fueled sprint, he was gaining on me. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, and finally got it started, backing out just as he slammed his body against my door. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw him get back up as if nothing had happened, standing there and staring in my direction. I was beyond shocked, my mind racing. You hear crazy stories like this, but you never think they'll happen to you. As I sped away from the rest stop, I was so freaked out, I probably broke the speed limit for miles. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I was too wired with adrenaline to even think about falling asleep. I still have no idea who that man was, where he came from, or what his intentions were. My best guess is that he was a homeless guy who wasn't right in the head, but even that didn't explain why he was lurking in the middle of nowhere. Since that night, I've avoided rest stops like the plague. I plan to keep it that way for as long as I can.